I'm out of coffee already.
You need coffee to talk about budget reconciliation.
Yeah. I just got my second shot today, so
That's good news.
I should probably hydrate.
I was going to say I'd probably drink water over coffee.
I know. I'm already like 4 shots into my coffee day. The first 2 is to get the kids to school. And the second 2 is to start my work day.
There you go. There you go. It's only noon Eastern time.
Okay, are we live? Thomas just kicked it out. Good. We will give everyone a minute or 2 to pile in. And then let's do some housekeeping. How we're going to run this show. We run a tight ship.
Tight ship.
On webinars.
Especially when we're talking about budgets.
Oh, and not just budgets, a budget reconciliation.
Reconciliation, that's right.
This is a artful process. I'm also closing doors. I'm a host of a homeschool today. The end is seemingly near, but not quite yet.
We have 4 days left.
Of school?
Yes.
Delicious.
All right.
Okay, Alison, let's kick things off. All right, housekeeping. I'll do housekeeping. We'll do introductions. We'll get into the issues and have a conversation, and hopefully we have a good amount of participants. We're eager for questions, observations, comments. So let's get into it. Housekeeping. You have a Q&A and you have a chat. We are more than a year into this pandemic process. I don't need to explain anymore. We're going to be paying attention to the Q&As. And if you want to chat among yourselves, you chat. So that said, I'm closing my chat window. I'm opening my Q&A window and watching that. We've all learned. We all know how to do that. Second, introductions. I'll be playing kind of moderator sideshow. Alison, you are so much more knowledgeable on this because you lived it. I have experienced it and dealt with it through, unfortunately, now decades of work on federal budget issues. So my name is David DeSchryver, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisor, Co-Director of Research, recovering education attorney. By that I mean I used to represent states and districts on federal financial compliance issues, and have, over my 20+ year career, tracked the federal budgets year in, year out, getting a sense of how they're able to marshal and manage and overcome political barriers and the vehicles for doing that, which is going to be a topic of today's conversation, which is budget reconciliation. What does that mean for the Biden administration, and what are we even talking about? What is this crazy thing? So Alison, let's give it a little background about your history, your experience with the reconciliation, and then we'll get into some questions and talking about what it is, what it's not, what we can expect.
Sounds great. So Alison Griffin, also Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors, been with the team for a little over 4 years, but I come to our work at Whiteboard from a policy career, particularly in higher ed, and at the federal level. As Dave mentioned, lived through budget reconciliation in 2005, which absolutely dates me in the context of this conversation. But I think actually laid the foundation for my understanding of different procedures and protocols that the Congress uses to frankly move legislation and to make change in policy and practice. So I'm excited to dive in on the conversation with you, Dave, and take questions and comments from our audience. I know we have folks signed up for the webinar today who also have experience with budget reconciliation. So it'll be fun to engage through the Q&A with our colleagues.
So it's going to be fun. Let's open it up with the question of the hour. What is budget reconciliation anyways? What is this thing, this vehicle that we're discussing? And maybe, you know, why are we talking about this?
Absolutely. So quite honestly, I step back to 2005, so 16 years ago, if you had asked me to define budget reconciliation, I probably would have assumed that you were talking to me about reconciling my personal budget. And the truth is, that's essentially what budget reconciliation is. It's reconciling the federal budget. And this is an action, it's a process that Congress undertakes not on a regular basis. There have actually only been around 20 budget reconciliations enacted since 1980, since the early 80s. And reconciliation, just a little bit of congressional history, was created by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, allowing Congress to consider pretty expeditiously tax legislation, spending legislation, and debt resolution legislation. And
now that's a lot of stuff. I mean, that's
a lot of stuff.
It's like there's some technical rules, but you dig into the technical rules and it's still pretty wide open.
Yes, and also like really wonky. I will say what's most important to remember about budget reconciliation is that it is used to address spending, and it can only be used to address mandatory spending. So a little just short primer for our colleagues around the virtual table. Mandatory spending is also known as entitlement spending, or funds that are used for programs that are required or authorized by law. Some of the better known entitlement programs are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security benefits. I think for those of us in the broader education and workforce and social service space, elements of the Pell Grant program, the food stamps program, those are all entitlement or mandatory spending programs. You know, the other part of the federal budget consists of discretionary spending, which Congress controls through the annual appropriations process. The key point to remember about budget reconciliation is that it is not used to address discretionary spending. So I'll pause there,
It
Dave.
is used to address spending.
It is used to address spending. That is correct.
So I can define this if it's in my interest fairly narrowly or broadly.
Or broadly, right. Which is where this process really opens up almost every issue on the congressional ledger, if you will, for some degree of consideration or debate, frankly, between members. So happy to, I mean, there's a pretty wonky process associated with how reconciliation happens, and we can talk through that.
What about why? Like why use this?
Why? So it really gives the controlling party a chance to advance their policy agenda.
So if you control both chambers and the executive branch,
and the executive branch,
it's kind of a lure to think about reconciliation.
Absolutely.
Such as when the Republicans controlled under Trump administration, what did we get? Tax package.
Correct.
That was done through reconciliation. Probably, I don't know how many people dialed into that, but it was done with through the reconciliation vehicle. And can it talk through like what's it required? Do you need majority? Do you need what's the voting bar that's necessary?
So I think you might be jumping ahead just a little bit. If I could maybe just outline how the process works, because I'm guessing that we have some folks on the webinar today who may not be as familiar with the ins and outs, frankly, of how a bill becomes a law. So if we could talk through some of the procedural pieces, I think we'll get to understanding what what it takes to actually pass the budget reconciliation. So suppose the House and the Senate, again, and we'll talk about this in a minute, both under Democratic leadership, want to proceed with reconciliation. We've already seen this happen once already this Congress, and Dave, I know you and I will touch on why it might happen again. But in that case, your House and Senate leadership have to come to an agreement on a budget resolution that includes reconciliation instructions or directives to congressional committees that have mandatory spending in their jurisdiction. So we've just talked a little bit about some of the programs that are mandatory spending programs or entitlement programs. Many of those programs are there's oversight for those programs by congressional jurisdiction, congressional committee jurisdiction. By a specific date, the congressional committees that have received instructions have to deliver a proposal for how they are going to address those instructions back to House and Senate leadership. So to meet that deadline, whatever that deadline is that's set by House and Senate leadership, the committees have to convene all of their members, both sides of the aisle, to talk about or debate which mandatory spending programs they are going to modify in order to reach that instruction. And usually that instruction involves a degree of savings, usually in the millions to billions of dollars.
Small,
like, coins in the sofa cushion. Millions or billions. So the committees are then instructed to increase or decrease mandatory spending over a certain amount of time. They are instructed to either increase or decrease revenue over a certain amount of time, or increase or decrease the public debt by a certain amount. So all those instructions are sent to the committees by House or Senate leadership. Those committees then convene their members by a certain date to advance whatever the committee decides is going to be their response to those instructions. So once the committee votes, make those changes to those programs, they send that recommendation back to the chamber's relevant budget committee. So House and Senate committees, they all meet, they come up with what they're gonna do, how they're gonna generate that cost savings. They send those recommendations back to their respective budget committees. Then the Senate and House budget committees compile all of the committee's recommendations into one big piece of legislation. And then those pieces of legislation are considered by the House and Senate. The House and Senate, as you know, don't always come to an agreement on what their legislation might be, what their agreements might be as it relates to cost savings. And they then appoint a conference committee to work out all those differences. Once the conference committee works out those differences, they send bills back to the respective House or Senate chamber. They vote, and hopefully they have a bill that then moves to the president. Now, I just boiled down probably what could take weeks or months into 6 minutes. And so the important thing to remember about this process is while it feels like it could happen pretty quickly, it actually takes time across the congressional calendar to bring members together, to talk about these issues, to debate these issues, to move bills back and forth, and to get to a final agreement.
Now, it does also require a budget resolution, as you mentioned. It is an adjunct to a budget resolution. And so let's talk a little bit just on the timing of that. Can you do 2 budget resolutions in 1 calendar year? That's kind of a trick question because federal government starts on October 1st. If FY21 was done December, they're now negotiating FY22. And so there was the opportunity for a budget resolution for FY21 when they passed what? The American Rescue Plan.
American Rescue Plan,
And
correct.
now we're back into a new budget season. And I've had some questions on, well, why it's now May? Where's the president's budget? Why isn't this formally out there? And my response is because there's a lot more riding on the starting and movement of this budget year than your typical year. So within a single calendar year, the answer is, I know the answers. I'm leading up to this. Yes, you can do, because you get have multiple fiscal years within one calendar year, and that's where we are right now. And the Congress, unless it happens today, or unless it has happened in the last few minutes, we don't have a budget from the White House. We have a skinny document of what they would like. And there's some big numbers in there, 20 plus billion over last year for Title I, ESEA, for example. And they have yet to release it. We think maybe like May 28th. But then.
Right, leading right up to the Memorial Day holiday.
Right. It's probably like a Friday before a holiday. Like,
we'll
see if that happens.
Friday at 2:00 or something.
And then the question is, can they also produce a budget resolution within a short period of time? But that comes after the president releases the full fiscal year 2020 request. And then once they get that request, the budget resolution will begin to move forward. I'm not sure, Allison, if we're even going to have a budget resolution, because that's the vehicle to make this all happen. You cannot do, and to emphasize that point of yours, you can't have reconciliation in the absence of a budget resolution, because the instructions are nested as a component of that.
Right.
And if you don't have that, everything else cannot happen. So we're going to be watching that very closely. And then, there you get the weighted probability of what's going to be part of this and what's not going to be a part of this. And it does certainly get wonky on that regard. Right. But let's
if we haven't gotten wonky already.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of it's extreme wonkery. But that pin on the need to have a budget resolution, without it, forget about it. Nothing happens. So everyone keep your eye on that one. Now, what's something surprising? What's your experience in dealing with the budget resolution that can kind of resonate with everyone listening here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that there have been just over 20 budget reconciliation bills since 1980. And the one that both you and I referenced, Dave, perhaps in your introduction of this conversation, of me as well, was 2005. So for those of you in the audience who track higher education legislation and policy, the budget reconciliation that happened at the end of 2005, and I can say almost like 3 days, I think, before the Christmas holiday, if I remember correctly, the bill actually put into motion. Pardon?
Happy holidays. Yeah,
happy holidays. Yeah, I kind of remember like sleeping on a sofa in a congressional office at that point in the year. But one of the key elements that was included in that 2005 budget reconciliation bill was what ultimately became the demise of the federal education loan program. So the private participation in the federal program was really started to unravel through that 2005 budget reconciliation bill, because the committee that I was staffing at the time, the House Education and Workforce Committee, received instructions from House leadership to save, I believe our committee received an instruction of close to $21 billion. And so we had to look to our mandatory spending programs, which at the time were 3, if I remember. It was the student loan program, it was vocational rehabilitation, and it was child nutrition school lunch programs. And for those of you in the virtual audience who are probably a bit politically savvy, to take money from programs that serve disabled workers and children who don't have access to food, we're not going to be politically palatable. And so instead, the committee at that time made a decision to look at the student loan program and make fundamental changes to that program to get our meet our reconciliation instruction from House leadership. Also, for some of you in the audience who may follow higher ed, this program has since gone away, but the creation of what was known as the ACG and SMART grant program, it was the Academic Competitiveness Grant program that was an add-on to Pell, actually got its start through the 2005 budget reconciliation. No longer in existence in the same way that it was, but I think Dave, to not tell too many stories out of school, but that was a compromise that came about between the House and the Senate on that budget reconciliation bill and how we were going to use some of those savings to try and put dollars in the hands of students at the time.
I want to dig into that a little bit because I think this idea and understanding that staff are working on a lot of these programs. And Anne asks a question, and I'll tie it into my question about the negotiations, about the process. Her question is whether Congress can pass or has passed a resolution before the budget is released. I'll say this: there's a saying that says, the president proposes, Congress disposes. The presidential request, the president has no authority in the budget process. The purse is controlled by Congress. So there's no reason. I think you're probably right. It did happen in the Trump administration. And that's because, the presidential proposal is a process. It's nice to have. Does Congress need it? No, they throw it out most of the time. So what's meaningful to track is what Congress wants to do in that ability, like you did, and it's happening now, even with conversations of partisan politics. There's still staffers are negotiating these issues because when something has an opportunity to move, it falls on them. So they're going to have to be ready.
You better be ready.
Better be ready.
And not only be ready with the members on your own side and your staff colleagues on your own side of the aisle. But, in the olden days, I guess, when we used to actually talk across the aisle and work things out, there were also opportunities early in that process to try and work out agreements or disagreements in advance of that process really getting underway with our counterparts across the aisle. I would say some of those days of collaboration and conversation have changed in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, you're closer to it than I am. It certainly has changed. Yeah. You have staff who've done this, and they know that the work has to get done.
Yes.
What I find encouraging, even with the bickering that goes on in the high level politics, when bills do move and when you have quick moving action, the quality of those bills tends still to be fairly high. Yes. And you recognize that most of these issues have been well vetted, have been well discussed. Not always.
Right.
We have plenty of examples of bad policy. Don't get me wrong. But when it comes to some of these spending issues and the nuances, even when we think about some of the tax bills that was passed under the Trump administration, a lot of big questions like, was this sloppily done? It was actually fairly well done. And so that's encouraging. Doesn't mean there's not problems, but to me, I think it's relatively encouraging. And it's, let's use that then to think about like going forward, what do we expect?
So also, if I could say 2 quick things, because I imagine we may even have some House and Senate staffers listening in. Hat tip to those who are doing the hard work of subject matter expertise, research, analysis, working with members in their committee, working with their own boss to understand some of the issues at play. It is the staff that do a considerable amount of the research and the writing and the work on behalf of their members. So I do want to acknowledge that. The second thing I'll say, Dave, and it goes to your point, I've long said that there are actually no new ideas, but there's a new time for an old idea. And so the fact that a lot of this work around, whether it's around a spending proposal, it's around a broader policy item, I would say, for 90% of the conversations that I'm even hearing today, I feel like they were the conversations that I was involved with 20 years ago. But the time is right, perhaps, for that old idea to become new again.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like figuring out how do we move this forward. Let's also clarify one point. I know you touched on it, but one of the reasons this has become a partisan issue, the filibuster. So the Senate filibuster 60 vote threshold tends to be an obstacle. Now with a reconciliation, you only need majority, 50+1. Is that correct?
Well, reconciliation bills are actually not subject to filibuster.
Not subject to filibuster. And if we reflect on the American Rescue Plan, let's recall that we had a big goose egg of Republican support. None. This opens up the question of, will Democrats do this again? And now let's think about American Jobs Plan, Americans Family Plan. What will be done, if anything, through reconciliation? And what's the political cost of doing this? And which is, we don't have answers, right? If we knew the answer to this, boy, we wouldn't be doing this webinar here today. We'd be sitting on a yacht somewhere, or yachts. If we knew the answer to that. So yeah, but it's worth recognizing that the politics is going to play heavily into the conversation. And so when I typically discuss what are the benchmarks to think about going forward, I don't find it hard to believe. It's true. We have midterm elections coming up soon. We're already into the midterm election cycle. And that tends to be driving the conversation, driving the narrative around what's going to be passed, what's not going to be passed, and how it's framed. I'll use a little bit of an example of when Biden gave his speech on the American Families Plan and his vision going forward. Like immediately, federal universal coverage for 3 and 4-year-olds became like the federal takeover of early education. Like you get down to a practical level, of course, people support early learning, childcare programs, but at this level, we're talking about sounding against midterm election policies and making sure that the constituents, if inevitably gerrymandered districts, hear what they want to hear. So that to me is an important caveat and a distinction between, like, what's the substance? What are you hearing in the headlines, and how do you interpret the conversations and the opportunities going forward? Since the midterm elections are critical, keep that in mind. The political optics are critical, framing that, and finding those issues that can both serve the interests of both parties without giving too much credit to anybody as we head into a midterm election. That's the question. And it's going to be it's going to be a challenge. So we can speculate on some of this stuff, but that optics, where can they find ground? Where are the staffers doing the meaty work? And how's that play against the optics of the midterm elections? That's to me, Alison, that's going to be some of the big questions going forward. Sure. And when we think about like what is an opportunity here, well, some workforce issues have to come to mind.
Yeah.
Obviously the Americans Jobs Plan, there's a few issues that we can think about and what's helpful, like $12 billion to institutions of higher education to address infrastructure gaps.
Right. Right. I mean,
I mean,
construction and building and technology and all the things that, yes, have been um, crumbling.
yeah, well,
Uh, yeah,
but
honestly,
there's also, and I think we got to figure out like what's the balance. So
right.
I think what's the earlier this week, Republicans began to put together their own infrastructure proposal, looking at roads, safety, public transit, um, certainly addressing like these tax issues that are being proposed that could be part of this. But ooh, that feels like election politics stuff. I'm not gonna bank on that one. But beginning to reconcile their understanding of what's infrastructure under some of the Biden's plan,
Right.
and thinking about that overlap is going to be important. I look at the community college infrastructure gaps. I feel like that has a chance.
Well, certainly with the First Lady championing community college, free community college, multiple pathways for learners. I think, we will continue to see a push around community college initiatives. Whether budget reconciliation is used to move that forward, I think remains a
Yeah.
question. um, Similar to additions to the Pell Grant program, building out that award level. Pell is part mandatory and part discretionary. There may be an effort to use budget reconciliation to address that award. The slippery slope that we get into with budget reconciliation, to be quite honest, is although it's argued that a lot of policy shouldn't be changed through a budget reconciliation. At the end of the day, we are making significant policy change through budget reconciliation. And I think what has been frustrating to those who observe, regardless if this is done by a Democrat or Republican controlled Congress, is that it doesn't leave much space for debate on these policy issues, these critical policy issues that underpin so much of what our country is built on and relies on with respect to a lot of these programs. At the end of the day, you have to remember budget reconciliation is a tool that is used by the controlling party to advance their policy agenda. And it doesn't allow for that honest debate and consideration of key policy issues that allows input from both sides of the aisle. And so when you talk about doing a second reconciliation bill, which is the word on the street now, particularly getting closer and closer to midterm elections, I honestly think the Democrats have to be very careful with how they use budget reconciliation and what they put in to that bill, that budget reconciliation bill, that does not backfire on local, especially on the House, local House races come November of 22.
Yeah, I think I want to dive into that because your point of let's not tarnish an issue by moving it through reconciliation. There's a lot of issues. And we tend to focus around what's been proposed in the jobs plan and the families plan. Digging a little bit into the jobs plan, some workforce issues. They've proposed 100 billion for workforce development programs. They have 400 billion for caregiving elderly adults with disabilities, 25 billion to upgrade and increase the number of childcare facilities. So you see kind of across the board early learning, elder, career development programs. These are all really meaningful, really important programs that preferably would be done through another vehicle. Now we hear that there's some conversation of doing this through some kind of workforce bill. Maybe they connect it to Workforce Investment Opportunity Act and be able to move on that relatively quickly. That's a vehicle. And I think to your point, if this is like really something that's bipartisan, at least at some level, a win for all the candidates, we'll likely not see it, I think, in the short run in a reconciliation.
Right.
So we're looking for and having conversations with those on the Hill and around the Hill on what does a workforce bill look like that can take some of these ideas.
Right.
And I'm sure at a different level, different scale, but begin to provide the seed funding for changes and investments to apprenticeship programs, for example, which is that was a priority under the Trump administration. It was a priority for Vice President Biden, if you recall, and it continues to be a priority I do a lot of work in K-12, that meaningful connection between Perkins and workforce training, and from middle to high school into some career. Computer science is a nice vehicle for doing that, but a lot of other vehicles as well. I think if I'm going to speculate on what happens in the meantime, as they think about a reconciliation, I think this WIOA reauthorization, dealing with some of these workforce issues, you see a bill, you see some language before they head home for the summer. I don't know if that's going to happen. That still seems ambitious.
That's ambitious. I mean, we're talking like really 4 weeks.
4 weeks. So,
right? Well, at least before the July 4th recess.
Well, now also what language looks like. We've seen historically, it can be anything from a one-pager with priorities to actual legislative language to statements. So it may be all over the place, but I do think when we kind of begin to unpackage what we're talking about for workforce issues, there's some ground for movement there. Higher education within the jobs plan, that community college addressing physical and technology infrastructure issues. Boy, it's tempting. It's tempting, but I don't know if I'm speculating.
Right.
No, I don't know. It's what, and you seem shocked by that.
No, I don't seem shocked. I think Democratic leadership is going to try and make a push for as long as they can to move some of these things on a reconciliation bill. Honestly, I think that these are initiatives that are so critically important to where we are as a country right now, coming out of the pandemic, particularly as it relates to jobs and employment and alignment between education and work. If I were, I guess, queen for a day, they deserve some really good and thoughtful debate and exchange. I do think we're at a moment in time when additional investment is required, but we can't make that investment strictly through a partisan, or we shouldn't make that investment strictly through a partisan budget process.
Yeah. Hopefully not. I'll flag a few other issues, and
sure.
Let's see whether we'll do a forecasting crystal ball into whether this is something that can move independently, or would it be part of a reconciliation?
Are we doing like this?
Thumbs down.
Okay.
K-12 education, closing the homework gap, and that's universal high-speed broadband, $100 billion for doing that. I'll just list them first. $100 billion for upgrading public schools, particularly those that with a decrepit kind of architecture. And we see a lot of our investments with ESSER into the HVAC and in cleaning up some of those systems and replacing them. And then the last one I'm kind of leading you on this. I think likely $45 billion to replace lead pipes and service lines, certainly for childcare facilities and in schools. But the lead pipe issue, boy, can we get some agreement on lead pipes are bad, and to the point of 45 billion. So, I do think that there may be an opportunity to move some of those forward. I think the infrastructure there's a long history of trying to get more federal investment into school infrastructure. It tends not to end well. I don't see anything historically that would change that, even though we clearly need it. On the internet coverage issue, there are recent investments. I don't know if that's going to be enough, but the FCC just provided final rules for expanding some of the services, particularly for low income families.
Mhm.
Um, but potentially, I think there's some, you tie in some of the 5G conversations and developing the infrastructure. I mean, there is some logic there. So the lead pipes though.
Sure. So let me say this, all the things you just raised, if Congress were to remain pure on what you just described, I mean, I think there's a pretty good chance that the I think tension that arises is when Congress doesn't stay pure on those issues and starts adding, right? Adding other issues for consideration to any one of those topics. And I think that's where then you run the risk of like getting into this territory.
Yeah.
But if Congress were to remain pure on what you just outlined, I feel like there's a pretty good chance that some of that could move through a reconciliation package.
I mean, but also, look, we don't need a reconciliation package if you have an annual appropriations bill that's going to be. So reconciliation is a vehicle where there's no bipartisan support. There
Right.
still needs to be a annual budget.
That's correct. With an omnibus spending bill, essentially. Right up before the Christmas holiday.
Yeah, they'll delay it, but the Republicans are actually in a fairly good position here because if they do nothing on annual appropriations, you get what they call a continuing resolution, which is a rollover of what happened last year.
That's right. And then you have a great talking point going into a midterm election.
That is not a good look for the Democrats in this administration.
That's right.
And so if they do nothing, if they sit back, the Democrats will have to come to the table. And if they have to come to the table, it's beginning to talk about what are the vehicles that they could move. Now, there are some stories about more of the left side of the Democratic Party saying, stop the negotiations. You're playing into their game. We're done. It's either all in historic funding or nothing at all. And that's still being sorted out. Like so if you watch the cable news of the evening networks and the negotiations are still happening. Everyone's still talking in a very cheery way. At least the Democrats are, not so much on the Republican side, actually. But we'll see. But I do think there is an opportunity for some of these as a component of the annual appropriations outside of full-on big spending reconciliation.
Absolutely. Well, I actually think that the question that was asked in the Q&A goes a little bit to what you've just touched on. Is there really any political risk in reconciliation? It seems like most people aren't paying attention to the process, more to the outcome, and are Democrats at risk of repercussion? So I think that that is true. I don't know that a lot of people do pay attention to the process, unless you're wonky like Dave and me, and we follow the process pretty closely. But the general American public, no, they're not paying attention to the process. I think where Democrats are at risk of repercussion is if the outcome is so significantly different than some of the promises that particularly the administration made in the early days of their time in the White House.
Yeah, and I would also, as mentioned before, the implications are in the midterm elections, and historically, there is a shift in one of the chambers when the executive branch shifts.
Yes.
So that is the expectation of the Republican Party to regain either or both of the chambers and then control the forecast. Sure. Can they get there by being cooperative? No, that's not in the cards. And so if you turn on some of the conservative networks, you know who they are, you'll hear conversations about, and this relates to critical race theory, it relates to all kinds of other things, but an indoctrination in the schools, and I'm just telling you what's being said, indoctrination of the schools or a federal takeover of a program. Like, folks, we're talking about universal preschool for 3 and 4. Can the federal government pay for it all? No. That's a different question. Are they positioning this as a very kind of bifurcated choice for the purposes of politics, yes. Let's talk about that. I'll use that as a springboard to talk about the American Families Plan, where they propose universal preschool, 3 and 4-year-olds, $200 billion. People love preschool. People love child tax credits. However, listen to the signals out there: indoctrination of kids, takeover of education. Like,
yeah, it's a powerful sentiment in, a number of states and communities right now.
and it's it's clearly playing out into election politics.
Absolutely.
So I probably wouldn't count on that. Is what I'm saying. Important. You may see the current vehicles in place, again, thinking about annual appropriations, where you can be increases for Head Start program, you can be increases for Child Care Development Block Grant.
Sure.
And those are probably reasonable increases or significant increases based on annual appropriations. 200 billion, probably not. But the signal is there. And
Yes.
in fact, states are doing things on their own. So I know we're talking reconciliation here, but
Right.
also the signals about the issues being discussed at the federal and state levels. Keep an eye on that. For example, California trying to expand their own universal pre-K program because of their budget revenues. So that's
Colorado.
Colorado, exactly. Higher education, free community college to all Americans, including dreamers.
Right.
I mean, that's additional assistance to, or increasing the Pell Grant.
Right. Well, and there's a lot of discussion right now if, an increase in the Pell Grant actually gets you to free community college.
Yeah.
And then, there are advocates who are calling on not just making community college free, but why aren't we talking about, 4-year institutions? Why aren't we talking about our minority serving institutions? So the conversation around free college has grown certainly louder over the last number of months.
And so is that, in your view, a path, an opportunity or path forward? If by saying you increase the Pell and if you are able to provide additional support for HBCUs, is that a way to say, we did it, we did free college, at least for a few years?
Well, I guess, my personal perspective is if you go after an increased Pell Grant award, I think you actually get bipartisan support on that issue. I think, the Pell Grant can be used at both 2 and 4-year institutions, across sectors of public and private higher ed, minority serving institutions. I think you reach more students with an increased Pell Grant, which essentially does make a portion of our higher education system free to students. And I think you could get some degree of bipartisan support on the idea of increasing Pell.
Yeah, and that to me feels like something that's much more feasible. There's a vehicle for doing that.
There's a history of doing it, although much slower than I think what learners require to cover the cost of higher ed. But there's a history of occasional Pell Grant increases.
Excellent. So I think there are a lot of issues. I do want to save a little bit of time for questions and comments. Again, the speculation game, the parlor game happening in DC is whether there's a reconciliation, what are the stakes, is it worth it, and what are the issues that would need to be driving that conversation, or may they fit into a vehicle that's going to move in a more bipartisan manner, annual appropriations, maybe workforce development program. So what are the vehicles that are moving? What can ride within those vehicles? And ideally, can it position one or the other party in a favorable way heading into, still feels far away, but it's not, heading into midterm elections. Those are the big issues going forward. Now, again, in recapping, budget reconciliation, it's an unusual vehicle done by parties that can control the chambers in order to move their priorities. We had it already for the American Rescue Plan. They've done it once. That was the last fiscal year. This fiscal year, the engines are running. There's another chance for a budget resolution, of which it would reside under, as authorized by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. So if we get that budget resolution, Now we're talking.
That's
Will
right.
the Republicans even let a budget resolution get out? That's, that's to be seen.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, sideways. I don't
yeah.
know.
And I think that's also an indicator of the ability to negotiate or the willingness to negotiate on some key factors. Like if you see that moving, they're
Yeah.
not going to allow carte blanche to do Democrats to do whatever they want. If there is a budget resolution, in my view, then there's actually some meaningful terms of negotiation so they can move forward on a more regular annual appropriation cycle. And that's where my attention would turn. And as you noted, boy, there's wonkery galore when it comes to the budget resolution. You got the Byrd Amendment, making sure no extraneous items are part of that to kick that out. And the final thing I'll note, and I know I said we're going to questions, the most powerful position in Congress right now would be the Senate parliamentarian.
Oh,
Now, she is in a position where she'll determine what the rules are. She interprets the rules, whether packages can be part of an interpretation of the original intent of the Congressional Budget Act. And if not, why, what goes in, what goes out. And if you'll remember, under the American Rescue Plan, they try to propose $15 minimum wage. Out. No can do on that one.
I
So
would say, yeah, for our audience, add that to your, Friday night trivia answers. If you get asked, who is the most powerful, who holds the most powerful position in budget reconciliation? It is the Senate parliamentarian. And I would say, before a couple of weeks ago, I'm not sure that many folks knew who that was, but
yeah, we probably still don't. She can walk down the street like, you're good, you're not, you're good, you're not, and nobody can stop. Nobody can stop her. Powerful position. Every household should have a parliamentarian. That's what I think. To make these kind of determinations of what is actually extraneous and what's not extraneous.
It's not.
So, so questions. Let's open that up. Any particular questions? I'm sure everyone has a particular issue that they're looking at or would like a reflection on, whether that be a K-12 and early learning, higher education. All of this is incorporated in that infrastructure. Drop it in there and we'll answer as they come up. If there are no questions over a set period of time, then we're going to wrap it up. And thank everyone for attending. You know how to reach us by email otherwise, if you're shy, and you can just send us directly.
So Dave, I did just drop in the short primer that I wrote on budget reconciliation. It actually covered a lot of what we talked about today. So that link is in the chat for our attendees.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful piece in Forbes. Provides a lot of clarity and a great resource for those trying to share some of the knowledge and information about what is budget reconciliation, how it works, and kind of what's where you should just stop asking questions because it's something's behind the curtain and you're not going to know.
That's right.
Which is a lot of it.
I would say always happy. You and I always happy to answer questions as folks have them about individual programs and certainly about the broader process itself. So also give a plug for our Monday budget webinars. Are we on track for this Monday or are we?
Next Monday, every other week. Here comes the kid.
So not the 31st because Memorial Day.
Yeah. Well, we'll sort out. We'll make sure that it's posted. We'll make sure to kind of send out the webinar schedule. If it's the 31st, we're missing in time, then we'll have to go forward and stay on our schedule.
Okay, real quick as we wrap this up, we did have a question pop up into the panelist chat about budget reconciliation, and is it typical to have multiple years where budget reconciliation is used? If it happens this year for a second time, my understanding is it will have been the first time that budget reconciliation has been used twice in one calendar year.
Yeah, we're going for record here. So and like bring it back to the Trump administration, the last big package, the tax package, reconciliation, ARP, reconciliation. If they're going to move something big, it's going to have to be through reconciliation. Otherwise, they're going to have to unpackage it and use your traditional vehicles to move that forward. A lot of that hinges on the political optics and what's meaningful for and informing midterm elections going forward.
That's correct. Great. Well, Dave, programming note, next budget webinar, Monday, June 14th.
Wonderful. Well, there we go.
All right.
We've got our answers. And again, if anybody have questions, you have about a minute now. Otherwise, you know how to reach us by email. We are available for that. And however we can provide some clarity or give you a weighted probability on what we think is going to happen based on what's happened in the past and based on what we're discussing and who we're talking to now, let us know. That's what we're here for.
Very good. Thanks, Dave. This was fun. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Alison. Talk soon.
Be well.